Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome back to another event in our lecture series, China, the New Science Superpower, ? That is jointly organized by the Berlin Contemporary China Network and my research group, the Lise Meitner group, China in the Global System of Science at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. We started the series last year and had a few events in which we looked at the quantitative and qualitative dimensions of China's perceived rise in the system of science over the past roughly 2 decades. We also looked into China, into structures of the science system there. Today, it is my great pleasure to have Marc Matten of the University of Nürnberg Erlangen with us, who will add more of a historical perspective and depth to our analyses and discussions. We record the event, but only the lecture part and not the Q&A. The videos of the last few talks have almost all been uploaded already to the BCCN's YouTube channel. You can find it by Googling BCCN on YouTube, or you go through our homepages, so either the Berlin Contemporary China Network pages or my group's pages. There you'll find links to the videos. And in the end, we'll also pool them in one big event page again. But now I'll hand over to Jelena Grosse-Bley, a member of the research group, for an introduction of Professor Matten. Jelena is a permanent visiting predoctoral fellow in the group and a PhD candidate at Humboldt University. She works on agricultural adaptations to climate change in China. Jelena, please.
Thank you, Anna. And it's my pleasure to add a few words of introduction to our speaker today before, of course, handing it over to him as soon as possible. Marc Matten is professor for contemporary Chinese history at Friedrich-Alexander University, Erlangen-Nürnberg. And here he holds the chair for sinology with a focus on the history of ideas and cultural history of China. He has a background in sinology, Japanology, and economics, and spent years abroad at various stages of his studies and research career, including at universities and research institutions in mainland China, Taiwan, the Netherlands, and Japan. His research interests are broad, but they include Chinese national identity, Chinese global history, the global transfer of knowledge during the Cold War, and questions around China's soft power today. From his extensive list of publications, of course, I could mention many, but let me just highlight a few related to today's topic. These include the 2018 article published in the journal East Asian Science, Technology and Society titled "Coping with Invisible Threats, Nuclear Radiation and Science Dissemination in Maoist China," and the 2019 article "Turning Away from the Big Brother, China's Search for Alternative Sources of Knowledge During the Sino-Soviet Split," which was published as part of a dedicated special issue, which was also co-edited by Marc Matten himself, together with Julia Obertreis for the journal Comparativ. His most recent book, which we'll learn more about today, Knowledge Production in Mao-era China, Learning from the Masses, was co-authored with Roy Kunze and came out recently, hot off the press in 2021. On the project website of his recently started multi-year project, Writing History with China, New Approaches in Global History, which is funded by the Volkswagen Stiftung, the description reads, "Especially in a time of strengthened global interconnectedness of historians, we argue that it is crucial to understand the social and cultural conditions of knowledge production in areas outside of Europe and North America." And with this, I hand it to you, Marc Matten. The virtual stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and especially the invitation to present here today some of my more recent research. The book that you're seeing and that you just also kindly introduced here is a book that we, Roy Kunze and I, wrote together. She wrote 3 chapters and me the other 3 chapters. It's up to you to figure out who wrote which chapters. There's a book that is has tried or is trying to write a history of science, not with a focus on the famous people, because we have sufficient studies on them, but trying to figure out how the dissemination of scientific thinking and the effort to justify the existence and the use of foreign knowledge in the Maoist society. Now, the history of science and technology in modern China has long been framed by three key paradigms. The first one is the very famous and well-known paradigm of Fairbank, who said that China's modernization was a response to Western impact. The second paradigm claims that China in this modernization process has always oriented itself to the outside world, starting with Europe in the 19th century, then with the United States after the First World War, and then, of course, with the beginning of the Cold War, the Soviet Union became the new model of orientation, then followed, of course, in the early 1980s by the so-called West. And the West, it includes various countries ranging from Japan, Western Europe, and North America. The third paradigm, which has also become under close scrutiny in the last years, is the acclaimed dichotomy of indigenous and foreign knowledge, or modern and superstitious knowledge. And I think you're all familiar with the many studies that have appeared in the last decade on the history and the social and the cultural history of Chinese medicine, for instance. Now, a number of case studies in recent years have tried to correct or to improve these paradigms. The question, however, how Maoist China, let's just say China at a time when science and technology were subjected to political control, and where the access to knowledge was highly regulated, the question was, how could you secure access to advanced foreign knowledge in a time where the party was playing such a strong role? This question is still unanswered. And the question that we could pose here in this context is, what were actually the criteria for allowing specific forms of knowledge to enter the country? Who decides on what kind of knowledge is entering the country, what is translated and what is not translated, and of course, what kind of knowledge is rejected and on what grounds? Now, in the following, I want to present some thoughts on these questions that are guided by two ideas. First, and this is a big claim, I know, but I think we can discuss that then at the end of my talk, is I claim that China was part of a global history of science even during the Maoist period. So the assumption that 1949 or 1978 were clear-cut ruptures that began the isolation of China and ended the isolation of China is somewhat misleading. And the second idea, or the second claim I want to make today is that the propagandistic attack on bourgeois, foreign or superstitious knowledge in Maoist China was largely ideology-driven. This, I think, is without any doubt. But this did not prevent forms of knowledge to take roots in China that actually did not accord to the holy principles of Marxism-Leninism, as an editorial in the Remini-Bau, the People's Daily, in 1951 claimed. Now, in this context, the Institute of Scientific and Technical Information of China at the Chinese Academy of Sciences played the most significant role. And it was founded in 1956 for the sole purpose of reacting to the growing tensions with the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin, to gather technological knowledge outside the Soviet Union and introduce it to Chinese scholars by translation. And the activities of that institution are today also part of my presentation here today. But before I introduce the role and the function of that institute, please let me allow a few remarks on the discourse of science and technology in Maoist China. Now, the discourse has often been described as a discourse where scientists were limited in their choice of research topics, where there was virtually little or virtually none academic freedom, especially during the times of the Great Leap Forward, for example, or the Cultural Revolution. And this has, in the larger context, been regarded as a proof that the more liberal a political system is, the less political interventions we have, and the more innovative or more creative science actually is. This is a claim which we can also discuss at the end together, because I think it is a claim that is bold, but not necessarily true. Now, the discourse of science in Maoist China was since the 1940s relying on historical materialism as a source of reliable knowledge. It fought against feudal knowledge and bourgeois knowledge, and the conviction in the superiority of historical materialism went so far that the People's Republic of China no longer saw progress and development as a result of fateful coincidence. We may think of Newton's apple, or as a result of a sudden revolution, as Thomas Kuhn later formulated it. But scientific progress was the consequence of thoughtful planning ahead of time. And similar to Stalinist Russia, Maoist China oriented itself by removing coincidence and contingency by envisioning 5- and 12-year plans of scientific development. And thus also the very common observation that science and technology became an integral part of planned economy and was subjected institutionally, organizationally, and financially to political leadership. Now, this is what you can see here is are two quotes or two kind of sources. On the left side, that is a propaganda poster. You're seeing a Chinese worker orienting himself to Stalin, taking the Soviet Union as the role model. And this poster is dating from 1950, from the 1950s. Now, on the right side, on the other side, you see cover page of a book that is dedicated to the prediction and of earthquakes. It came out in 1974, and in that book, which was published during the Cultural Revolution, it is claimed that the process of accepting knowledge from abroad is something like you have to digest the foreign knowledge and then to take over the things that are suitable and to throw away the rest that you can't use. And this is basically something which happened during the Cultural Revolution, and even some years before that, when after the Sino-Soviet split, China was no longer orienting itself to the Soviet Union, but tried to delve into some kind of strains of indigenous knowledge and using that for various purposes, as I show together with Rickens in our book. Now, the central epistemological principle in science was inductive reasoning. And this is, of course, made prominent by Mao Zedong's text on practice, published in 1937. I think you all know that text. But this text was key to the discourse of science and technology throughout the whole Maoist period. And he claims there that, I quote, man's social practice alone is the criterion of truth of his knowledge of the external world. And he was claiming that the ideas of social practice, that is economic production, class struggle, and scientific experiment, would guide the scientist as well as the worker, the farmer, in producing scientific knowledge. So he claims that neither did theoretical knowledge exist a priori, nor were theories to be formulated first and proven later. And it was very obvious for Mao that it would be ridiculous to claim that a scholar knows of the world's affairs without stepping out of his study room, a sentence or an expression that we can find in many of Mao's texts. And as a consequence thereof, Maoism could not accept falsibility as a criterion of distinguishing scientific from non-scientific knowledge, primarily because the future or progress was understood as non-contingent. And this again then led to the many interventions, political interventions into science technology giving the impression, especially with regard to the Cultural Revolution, but also the Great Leap Forward, that the Maoist period was anti-scientific. This is an argument that we can find in the history of Chinese science, as well as, of course, in recent or in the continuous justifications of the Communist Party for the reform and opening, claiming that because there was no freedom and autonomy of the scientists before 1976, we couldn't generate so much progress and thus had to introduce the reforms in 1978. However, these interventions that were central and were prevailing during the Maoist period not only concerned the scientists who was working within China, but also related to the question of how to deal with knowledge imported from abroad. And as you know, and this is, I think, well known, after the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949, the young state relied heavily on the import of science and technology from the Soviet Union. And this created, in fact, three major problems. First, it was necessary to reconcile the foreign knowledge with indigenous knowledge. Second, it was necessary to ensure that the foreign knowledge that was taken over did not contradict the holy principles of historical materialism. And third, the new knowledge had to be adapted because it had been produced in a different political, social, and cultural context. And I think the most well-known and most well-researched case in that respect is the case of traditional Chinese medicine that was first kind of persecuted and criticized as a superstitious and anti-scientific practice. And the favoring of Western biomedicine since the Republican period continued in the 50s until then. In the Great Leap Forward, the late 1950s, the lack of financial resources and many other reasons led then to new concentration on the development of traditional Chinese medicine, both in human medicine and in veterinary medicine. And this then has resulted in the coexisting of two different sets of scientific knowledge that are not necessarily seen contradictory anymore. Of course, depending on whom you ask, but it is not that the one is given up for the other. Now, any analysis of the transnational interrelatedness of science in the PRC has to start with the year 1953, when Soviet experts were invited to China. And taking the Communist Party of the Soviet Union as the best teacher from which China could learn, the 1950s saw a huge influx of Soviet experts who provided Chinese workers and peasants with new knowledge and technology in virtually every area of economic production. And in fact, from the early 1950s on, we can see a bustling activity of translating Soviet texts and books and manuals and journals in science and technology. And if you have a look at the Chinese General Title Catalog for the years 1949 to 53, we have thousands and thousands of Soviet books that were translated and made available in China. And in the agricultural sector, for example, the journal Soviet Agricultural Science, the Sulianungyekirche, was a journal that was a verbatim translation copy of the Soviet one, and it dealt with new discoveries in plant breeding, the use of herbicides and pesticides, animal husbandry, and all the problems that were seen to be relevant for the development of the Chinese agriculture. And in all other fields, you can see the same development. Now, despite Mao Zedong's later warning against the mechanical absorption of foreign material in his 1956 speech on the 10 major relationships, the CCP during the 1950s took over in almost wholesale fashion the Soviet model of economic development in the first 5-year plan. And the booklet on science work in our country that came out in 1953, it includes reports on the divisions of the Chinese Academy of Science, as well as a number of pieces taken from the People's Daily that mention in virtually every article the superiority of the Soviet Union in scientific research. And so all the readers were then called to thank the Soviet Union for the help that would surely speed up, I quote, China's industrialization in the steel, petroleum, and cement industry, in paper mills, or in veterinary medicine. In 1956, then, the year when the Soviet Union was seen, or the Soviet reading of science was seen more and more critically, which was also related, for example, to the critique of Albert Einstein. It was related to the fate of Lysenkoism in China that was criticized from 1956 on. The PRC developed at the guidance of Soviet experts the long-term plan for the development of science and technology. And the plan reflected Mao Zedong's conviction that the party can exercise leadership in science through planning. Now, planning here is not to be understood in a literal sense, because the idea of the plan was to provide access to knowledge, and access to knowledge meant that first to identify the fields and the disciplines where knowledge was lacking. Second, it meant to develop and strengthen those research institutes that had only been recently established, such as the institutes for research in physics, chemistry, geology, and so on. It was also called upon to fund and to establish those research institutes that were still missing, like in mechanics, mining, inorganic chemistry, genetics, and so on. And last but not least, to educate the cadres that they were able to run the institutions while absorbing the knowledge and experience from other countries. And as the following quote shows, there is a clear focus on the Soviet Union, but it went even further. And for this, the Institute of Science and Technology Information of China was responsible. The history of that institute still remains to be written, but what is important is that its members had access to various kinds of knowledge. And I'm going to show you in a moment where all that knowledge came from. But it was, they were tasked by the scientific researchers in the research institutes to figure out what is the status of, let's say, organic chemistry research in the United States. And then they were contacting using various channels of information. And this is something which we really do not know much about, because the most part of the information on that field is still considered to be a NABU. This is, say, internal archival resources. So we don't have access to the Institute's archive, but it would be very interesting to know how do they get that knowledge and what channels they were using. This is something where I have to admit I don't know anything about it, but that is a huge gap in research. Likewise, the Institute was tasked with the promotion of international cooperation and flow of science and technological information. The reason for founding this institute was, as Mao Zedong wrote in an article in the 1956, is that if we only rely on Soviet experts, we still we will have access to advanced knowledge, but we would increase the burden of Soviet experts, and we also need to know what is happening in the capitalist countries. End of quote. So an exaggerated dependence of the Soviet Union was seen critical starting in 1956, and this then led to the effort to found this institute. There was one other reason, which is often forgotten in that context, that is namely the fact that during the Great Leap Forward, which followed the founding of that of this institute, during that time, the Communist Party propagated the 8-point Charter of Agriculture, and that put a mechanization of agricultural production as well as the introduction of scientific farming methods on the political agenda. And shortly after the promotion of that charter, Yuan Longping, who later had this great success in creating the new rice varieties, but at the time when this 8-point charter was promulgated, he observed that farmers started to sow rice too early, thereby acting against the long-cherished ideal of not mistaking the right time. And in traditional farmer knowledge, not to miss or not to confuse the right time to start sowing, to start harvesting, and so on. And according to Yuan Longping, this now contradicted some of the laws of nature, according to which every task in agricultural production had to be done according to the season. And if one sowed too early, he argued, the seeds would rot due to weather conditions. So what he did was he proposed to amend the 8 points by adding a 9th one, namely the 不务农时, and the problem was now changing 8 points to 9 points would mean to go against the highest directive of the chairman of the party, and this amounted to counter-revolutionary thinking, as he was then to discover during the Cultural Revolution. So he was punished for that mistake only in 1966. So this case shows that the charter itself was not simply a technical one, but one that was deeply permeated by ideology of class struggle, and it refused to hear the voices of the experts. However, this should not, as I argued earlier, not mislead us to understand or to argue that the Maoist period was anti-scientific on a general scale. And this can be shown by the publications of this Institute of Science and Technology and Information. And what you can see here is the 科技 which had, as you see on the left side, is that is published in March 1966. This is shortly before the Cultural Revolution, and this is the 国外部分. So this is the part of foreign knowledge from foreign countries. And on the right side, you see here one article taken from that journal that is reporting that the Gemini rocket space program of the United States was successful, and it was the Gemini 6 and 7 mission that took place in late 1965. And this is basically a summary of what a French space expert was reporting in the Reuters agency in London. And if you see through all of these issues of the science and technology reference news, you find very different contributions. The first one here marked in red, I just introduced, that was the telegram from Cape Kennedy. The second one I want to introduce you is the second one in red here is on the use of radioactive isotopes for predicting, for making weather forecasts. Was taken from the United States, and last but not least from Great Britain, an article that was researching whether a certain kind of coal could be used for making iron. So from the range of the countries of origins, you can see that they had access to various publication outlets in Japan, West Germany, France, Soviet Union, and so on. But here we can already see that there's a significant focus on the United States. If you just would go through all the editions and you would quantify that, you would see that basically half of the 40% of the information is stemming from the Soviet Union, another 40% from the United States, and the rest of the world. So it is a very clear pattern of orientation that we can observe in this journal. Now the question now is, if we could do two things. We could claim on the one hand that this knowledge we can see here is only technological knowledge. This is nothing related to, let's say, major scientific questions. This is applied knowledge, and the taking over of applied knowledge is supposed to be something very, very easy. However, we have at the same time very intense discussions taking place at the time that are full of epistemological reflections asking whether knowledge is innocent or whether knowledge is class-based. And for someone who is then belonging to the Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution, for instance, this question could only be answered in the one way and not in the other way. But the thing is that all the theoretical discussions now orient themselves to historical materialism and try to define the knowledge, the correct knowledge, to be that knowledge that is in accordance to historical materialism. And the people, or the philosophers or the science philosophers that have been influential here were, next to Karl Marx and Lenin, of course, Bukharin, and later then Michael Polanyi. Polanyi was also received in Maoist China quite early, because, as we know, he met the Soviet philosopher Bukharin in 1935, and the discussions on that and their interaction has been recorded in Soviet texts, which were then translated into Chinese. And the very important insight that Polanyi gained during his meeting with Bukharin was that the Soviet notion of science held that the fundamental tenets of natural dialectic and historical materialism eventually limited the scientist's autonomy. So the declared aim of modern science was to establish a strictly detached and objective knowledge outside and independent of political interventions. Then this was so-called the ideal of pure science that in the European tradition, as Polanyi wrote, was grounded in the conviction that there's a factual reality that can epistemologically be grasped and described truthfully. And therefore, free debate was fundamental for science. Now, this is, of course, in total contrast to the socialist position, according to which science could and should be planned. And we have then in 1958, and this is precisely the first year of the Great Leap Forward, we have for example, the physicist and vice president of the Chinese Academy of Science, Wu Youxun, who had studied nuclear physics in France and in the United States, he warned against doing research in the sense of la science pour la science, the way Kirche are Kirche, because doing science without considering its practical applications would be detrimental to socialist construction. Nie Rongzhen, the military leader and later leading responsible figure in the Chinese nuclear weapons project, argued the same year that science can certainly be planned and that socialist states should not allow freedom in scientific research as capitalist societies do. And this is then a discussion which, again, in 1976 rises again in a lot of NEBU publications of the Shanghai Academy of Social Science, where they were actually tasked to now start again or start anew with a free debate on what science actually is. And there the same arguments are recycled again and again, but now turned upside down. Now, as you have seen, this institute that was founded, as I said, in 1956, had the aim to provide information on the development of science and technology in foreign countries. And because the Beijing institute was so successful, 2 years later, on the 27th November of 1958, a second institute was founded in Shanghai, and it was named the Institute of Scientific and Technological Information of Shanghai. In 2008, this institute published a history in the first 50 years, and it's very instructive to read that, because it forgets to mention that the Cultural Revolution happened, for example. So it's very focused on the time after 1978. So the part on the first 20 years of the institute is very short compared to the later 30 years. You may know this institute because in 1995 it merged with the Shanghai Library, the Shanghai Tushiguan, and so much of the information system that the Shanghai Tushiguan is currently having, especially in the digital sphere, is actually going back to the collections of this Institute of Scientific and Technological Information, founded in 1958. Now what this institute did, starting from 1960, was to organize regular conferences, inviting scientists and technical experts from Shanghai to join them and to tell them, okay, what kind of knowledge do you actually need? And so in 1961, a survey revealed that there were actually 118 projects that need access to non-Chinese scientific research, but only in 5 projects this access was actually existing. And so to improve the situation, the institute in Shanghai decided to set the focus on patent documentation, the Zhuanli Wenxian. And then up until 1963, the number of patents filed in America, West Germany, Great Britain, France, and Japan reached more than 10 million. This was recognized. And so they requested American colleagues to ship basically the patents from the United States to China, which was then happening in 1969. So they received 2 containers full of American patents, because at that time everything was on paper, of course, and then they started to translate. So we have, starting from the late 1960s, we have an existing corpus of translated patents that this institute was providing. And these transfer efforts now to translate them, this was nothing that happened behind closed doors, but was also aiming for larger, greater publicity. So what they did is they advertised in scientific journals the list of patents that they had, or the list of publications that you had, and you could order them by postal mail and then receive within a week the newest publication on, let's say, linear accelerators in the United States, and then use that for your own purpose, and so on. Likewise, they organized a lot of science dissemination exhibitions that were open to the public. And in 1964, the Shanghai Institute organized an exhibition on 4 new technological fields, where in total 283 work units showed 1,128 items to the audience, and tutorials on how to search for scientific information was offered to 4,000 interested visitors each day, thus making it a great success, as the history of that institute published in 2008 claims. It's very hard to check these numbers. Now, why this transfer was accepted and why it was considered unproblematic is something which we can, as I said before, can be explained by reference to, okay, it was only applied knowledge. But there was a deeper discussion among the experts, and that's related to the question of what is truth in science. Now, there are two publications which I want to introduce you to very shortly. The first one is a short booklet published in 1956 that discusses the question of truth. What is scientific truth? And it argues that truth is one of the most central questions of epistemology in Marxist philosophy, whether the definition of truth is subjective or objective, and what the proper criteria of definition is. And the rough line of argument in this book, I think, is something of the obvious. It is that idealism and metaphysical speculations cannot be true. And so truth is a philosophical problem that has, however, also a basis in daily life. And what one needs to do is to recognize that the correct knowledge is conforming to the objective reality. And this became visible, as the authors argue, during the cooperation movement in agriculture, when the discussion emerged whether such policy was too much a rush forward and thus not a realistic effort. And the ensuing strengthening effort of party leadership to intervene in the campaign was not because progress in the countryside was too slow, but because political leadership was less ambitious than the farmers and thus had to strengthen leadership on the countryside. So any cognition or knowledge that correctly reflects the objective world and the laws of development, that is called truth. So truth was always related to Fadan, to the development. And this, of course, also entailed economic development. Now, these very ideological and very kind of, if you read these booklets, it's they all come along in the same tone. They all make the same argument. And sometimes it's very boring to read these texts. But both authors claim and show that truth is not something static, but something that is constantly changing. And so you can discover new knowledge only then when you apply dialectics to the object in question and situating it into the larger context. And in that context, of course, the Mao's text on practice of 1937 that I introduced earlier, this was one of the key texts that should guide the scientist in recognizing the real knowledge. Here we have it again. This is a quote that kind of is the gist of Maoist epistemology of knowledge. And what we have shown, what I've shown together with Roy Kunz in our book is that social practice actually is the primary criteria of defining science and of disseminating science. On the dissemination part, I'm going to show you one example at the end, which is quite intriguing. But what's important here to mention is that knowledge should never be separated from practice. And this is something which then is also one of the prime reasons why the science dissemination efforts in Maoist China were and today still are so successful. So the belief in the possibilities of science, of providing scientific solutions to all problems, is something that has something to do with the close link to social practice. Now, in 1963, then, Mao Zedong, in the time between the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, again stressed the importance of practice in a text called Where Do Correct Ideas Come From? And he argues there that correct ideas stem from the three kinds of social practice: the struggle of production, the class struggle, and scientific experiment. And it was scientific experiment that gained a highly important role in all the discussions on the epistemology of science at that time. Now, the other book, which also played a very important role is, as you see already from the title, how important that is, Seeking Truth from Facts by Guanfeng, published in 1956. It presents a straightforward argument for overcoming one's epistemological arrogance. And Guanfeng considers this to be important to avoid subjectivism in scientific research. And to make his argument understandable, the author begins his book by telling a joke of the Irish philosopher George Berkeley, born 1685 and he died in 1753. And the joke tells that George Berkeley once stumbled over a stone during a walk in the countryside. Now, when hurting his foot, Berkeley said to his company that the stone came into existence only after he touched it. Thus, the existence depended on perception. Now, what is important to point out is that Guanfeng shares this idea. So he's not arguing that the stone was already there, we just don't know it. No, it came into existence after touching it, after kind of stepping on it. And what is now very important to see here is that for Guanfeng, a similar idea can be found in the writings of Lu Xiangshan. And Lu Xiangshan of the Song Dynasty, what is very confusing when reading this book is that you always stumble upon another formulation statement in that book that Guanfeng says that Lu Xiangshan was a scholar of the Ming Dynasty, but that is apparently totally wrong. But we don't know why he had the idea that Lu Xiangshan was from the Ming Dynasty. Now, Lu Xiangshan had become famous for the quote that you see here on the slide: "The affairs of the universe are my own affairs, and my own affairs are the affairs of the universe." And now in the reading of Guanfeng, this implies that whatever a man's heart defines what is correct, that is correct. That is to say, matter follows the idea. However, if we read this paragraph a little bit closer, we can show that the use of my own affairs, that is literally to be translated as my heart, is less referring to one's own selfish desires or to imply that one's principles correspond to the principles of the universe. Rather, and this is the interpretation of Guanfeng, Lu argues that one's principles are in harmony with those of the universe, as shows the fact that the sages since the ancient past have brought forth the same mind and the same principles. So to be in harmony with the universe, that is the prime message that he takes from his reading of Lu Xiangshan. Now, what is important is then in the second part of the book, and this is a very short booklet, which is written in a very colloquial style. It's very easy to read. You can just go through it very quickly. What is important here to mention is that Lu Xiangshan was, of course, a declared critic of Zhu Xi, the other great Neo-Confucian scholar. And Lu now considered the mind alone as sufficient for achieving self-cultivation and equated the mind with the universe itself. Thus, he had an explicit antipathy towards books. Zhu Xi, on the contrary, always insisted that one needed a specific external regimen in order to recover the original heart mind, the Benqin, and this included a close reading of the classics because knowledge was acquired through extensive investigation. In other words, to reject the classics and to rely on one's mind only was unacceptable for Guanfeng, because what meant to reject the classics? To reject the classics meant not to read Mao Zedong's works. And to rely on one's mind only, that reminded Guanfeng of the autonomy of the scientists. And this was impossible to accept. So he identifies at the end of the book 3 enemies of the correct epistemology of science, which are self-pride, single-handed decisions, and third, the separation from the masses. And in order to avoid these, it is imperative to ensure humbleness, to allow for collective discussions and collective leadership, as well as the will to consult with the masses. And of course, I mean, 1956, these are all expressions which we find in the political discourse of that time. And the conclusion that I just presented here to you is undoubtedly, and of course, shaped by the Maoist vision of voluntarism. Yet by rejecting the existence of an absolute truth, the space of knowledge production is not only located in the distant mind of the scholar, but in daily practice. And this is something which Mao Zedong has been emphasizing in his text on practice. And Mao then, of course, in this text, as you all know, he later emphasized also in his 1963 text on where do correct ideas come from. He says that knowledge needs to be tested and refined endlessly, and in this principle allows the consideration of any kind of knowledge, may it be capitalist, bourgeois, superstitious, or simply absurd. And this explains why traditional Chinese medicine, though being anti-scientific from a certain point of view, could re-emerge in the Maoist period, and also other technologies. And at the end of my presentation, I want to show you one technology that actually generated a lot of progress, if only on a limited scale. And these are ball bearings. Now, during the Great Leap Forward, the idea in the modernization of agriculture was to improve transportation. You needed transportation for transporting the harvest. You needed transportation for establishing new fields. You needed good transportation methods to build the famous dams, the dam building, and so on. You had to move stones, sand, earth, and whatever in large quantities. And at that time, it was recognized that the mechanization of agriculture was impossible to achieve, because according to the Soviet model, that would have meant the import of hundreds of thousands of tractors. But of course, you can imagine this was not a feasible approach, especially also because the field size, especially in southern China, was quite small. So you can't have these huge, massive tractor machinery kind of running over the field. That would have been totally impractical. But on the countryside, in the villages, you had these kind of transportation. I'm missing the English word. Wheelbarrows. And these wheelbarrows were produced on a local level. So every farmer had a wheelbarrow that was constructed by his materials at hand, so they differed largely. But what now came up at the time was that you could introduce ball bearings, which would reduce friction, and then, of course, the capacity of transportation could increase. So we at that time have a lot of experiments on the countryside to invest and to find the best way to create ball bearings. And there's one report of the Suqian County in Jiangsu province that is said to have been able to establish 23 ball bearing factories that produced 30,000 of these balls on a daily basis, after having only spent 8 days on constructing the necessary tools. Now, question if these numbers are correct or not, as reported in the People's Daily and as well as in handbooks that were disseminated among the farmers, is impossible to do. But what a handbook, a manual for a farmer reports is that formerly, without the wheel or without the ball bearings, they could transport 200 jin, that's to say 100 pounds. No, it's 200 pounds on a wheelbarrow. But with the ball bearing, you could raise the capacity to 600 jin. So you could move 3 times the amount. Now, what's very interesting is a film which I discovered when writing the book is the handcart with steel balls, the Gangzhou Feiche. And this is a very interesting film, which you can find on YouTube also. It tells a story about production cooperative in southern China. And then the question arises if the wheelbarrow should not be improved with the ball bearings. And then the work teams, they start a competition who is building the best wheelbarrow with the best and most sturdy kind of ball bearings. And the nice thing about this film is that the work teams are split across along the lines of gender. So you have one female team and you have one male team. And of course, the female team wins because it shows a greater perseverance in actually producing the balls, and then they gain the victory in the competition on which team can transport the most bags of rice in the shortest period of time, right? Now. At the end, we still have now the question arises: what would the balls were made of? And they had different approaches to that. Of course, the most ideal ball bearings were made out of steel. They would be the most sturdy ones, but as you can imagine, steel was not always available, especially during the Great Leap Forward. And this then resulted in a frenzy in devising creative alternatives. And Anna-Louise Strong, the famous American journalist and activist who lived in China from 1958 until her death, reports in her observations on the people's communes that instead of steel balls, they were using balls made of glass or porcelain. And in one specific county in Sichuan, they even used acorns because the Sichuanese oaks, they had perfectly round or nearly perfectly round oaks that were then integrated into races made of bamboo. So it was a non-standardized solution to the problem because it was all about improving the existing wheelbarrows. So a kind of general or central solution would not have been feasible. And this actually is the gist of the science dissemination in the Maoist period, where agency is given to the worker and the farmer to devise solutions. And to be able and to claim that these solutions were all scientific, then of course convince the population that science is actually a solution to virtually every problem. And we have this also in other sources where they develop railways made out of bamboo, which were apparently were working, or you had this this sun cooking. It's a kind of mirror made out of aluminum or a kind of tin foil, which reflects the sunlight, where you can just put your noodles and you get your 3.5 bungjin of cold water, get it boiled in 25 to 30 minutes. So it was a very efficient way. You didn't have to chop firewood and so on. And these are something which we find in the science dissemination channels and the science dissemination materials of the Maoist period, especially during the Great Leap Forward, on a large scale. That would be all from my side. I'm looking forward to your questions and the ensuing discussion.